Chapter 1: The Rebels Rise. Chala stood amidst the ruins of his homeland, a kingdom crushed by complacency. The ruling monarchy had failed to defend its people, leaving them vulnerable to external threats. As a warrior born to lead, Chala found himself unwilling to watch his people suffer. He formed a rebellion, a ragtag group of freedom fighters, and began striking at the regime's weak spots. With intellect, strategy, and relentless determination, Chala soon became a symbol of hope to the oppressed. But with each victory, the rebellion's leader began to crave more. As they gained ground, Chala's ambition grew, and he saw himself as not just a liberator, but the only one capable of guiding his people into a new era. The kingdom's forces pushed back, but they couldn't break his resolve. It became clear, Chala wasn't just fighting for freedom anymore, he was fighting for absolute power. One fateful night, in a long-forgotten temple deep within the jungle, Chala discovered an ancient mystical artifact, an orb, radiating dark energy. The voices from the orb promised unmatched strength. In desperation, he took it. The power surged through him, overwhelming his body and mind. He now had the strength to end the war. But the cost would be much higher than he ever anticipated. He became the Crimson Panther. Chapter 2: The Deal with Darkness. The Crimson Panther's newfound power was intoxicating. The dark energy coursing through his veins brought forth a terrifying transformation. His strength, speed, and rage were amplified to unimaginable levels, allowing him to crush the regime's forces with ease. No one dared to challenge him, his rebellion was swiftly becoming a conquering army. His once pure ideals became clouded with lust for control. The people hailed him as a hero, but the cost of victory was slowly starting to erode his humanity. With his power growing, the Crimson Panther turned his sights on ruling the kingdom. The monarch was defeated, and the Crimson Panther took his place, seated on a throne built on bloodshed and conquest. His elite army followed him loyally, driven by fear, and any whispers of dissent were crushed before they could gain traction. Yet, the mystical energy that had granted him such strength continued to consume him, gnawing at his spirit. He could feel the darkness within him, but he ignored it, telling himself it was a small price to pay for peace. Despite his newfound power, something began to shift. The Crimson Panther's mind was clouded by rage and delusion. He no longer saw himself as a protector but as the embodiment of order, willing to destroy anyone who threatened his perfect vision of the world. His rule, built on the ashes of rebellion, would be absolute. He was no longer a man of ideals, he was a monster, a tyrant, and nothing would stand in his way. Chapter 3: A New Empire. As the Crimson Panther solidified his rule, his kingdom became a reflection of his power. He was no longer the rebel fighter, the man who once fought for his people's freedom. He was a ruthless ruler who governed through fear, demanding total loyalty from his subjects. His mystical abilities allowed him to manipulate not only his enemies but also his own soldiers, twisting their will to serve him. Those who dared to resist were met with swift and brutal consequences. The cities that once stood as bastions of resistance were now mere shadows of their former selves. The Crimson Panther used his power to manipulate the minds of those around him, turning allies into puppets, ensuring no one would challenge him. His elite army followed his every command, but they did so out of fear, not loyalty. As he consolidated his power, his once noble intentions gave way to an obsession with total dominance. The Crimson Panther began purging anyone he suspected of treason, including those who had fought beside him in the rebellion. The more power he wielded, the more the Crimson Panther began to change. His physical appearance grew monstrous, his once proud body now a twisted form of strength and rage. His temper flared uncontrollably, and he began to suspect everyone around him. His heart became cold, and his mind twisted with paranoia. The Crimson Panther had become something far more dangerous than he ever intended, he had become a tyrant with no room for mercy. Chapter 4: The Price of Power. The power the Crimson Panther had so eagerly embraced began to take its toll. His body, once the epitome of strength, now bore the scars of the mystical energy. His skin became discolored, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire. As the darkness consumed him, the man he had once been, the hero of the rebellion, was slipping away. He felt the magic's pull, driving him to commit even darker acts, all in the name of ensuring his reign. The people who once adored him began to fear him, for they had seen what he was becoming. Those who had once believed in the Crimson Panther's vision now saw a monster in his place. His rage became uncontrollable, and his rule grew more oppressive with each passing day. He began to lash out at anyone who even dared to suggest that his reign was flawed. He felt the power inside him growing, but with it came the realization that he was losing himself. Yet, he refused to acknowledge it, believing that his actions were justified. The Crimson Panther's isolation deepened. He trusted no one, not even the closest of his allies. The mystical power that had given him everything was now taking everything in return. He had once believed that the power would grant him the peace he sought, but now it was clear that it was driving him to madness. Yet still, he clung to the belief that only he could lead the kingdom to its rightful place. Chapter 5, Whispers of the Fallen. In the shadows of the Crimson Panther's empire, whispers of defiance began to stir. Former generals who had once fought by his side, now disillusioned by his descent into madness, began to rally what little resistance remained. Among them was Kahala, a former ally who had once believed in the Crimson Panther's vision of a better world. Now, he saw only a tyrant. Kahala, along with a few trusted comrades, secretly began to gather forces, hoping to reclaim the land from the grip of the Crimson Panther. The fallen generals lived in fear, knowing that the Crimson Panther would never forgive them for betraying him. They were hunted, their names spoken only in hushed tones. Their rebellion was fractured, scattered across distant lands, but their resolve remained strong. The Crimson Panther had once been their brother, their leader, but now he was a monster. Each general struggled with the guilt of their past, knowing that they had helped bring about the reign of a man who would destroy everything they had fought for. The resistance remained small but steadfast. Kahala and his band of survivors carried out covert strikes, freeing villages from the Crimson Panther's control. Yet, each victory felt hollow, knowing that they were no match for the vast might of the empire. They began to wonder if anyone, even with the combined strength of their forces, could truly defeat the Crimson Panther. Chapter 6, The Monster Within. As the Crimson Panther's power grew, so did his inner turmoil. The mystical energy that had once felt like a gift had become a curse, gnawing at him from within. His rage consumed him, turning him into a brutal and unstable ruler. He no longer cared about his people or his kingdom, only his own insatiable hunger for more power. The more he used the dark magic, the more monstrous he became, both in body and in mind. His elite army, once the heart of his empire, began to fall apart. Loyalty gave way to fear, and fear to resentment. The soldiers who once fought with pride now trembled in the face of their king's wrath. The Crimson Panther trusted no one, and even his most trusted commanders began to question their loyalty. He became paranoid, suspecting that betrayal was everywhere. His violent purges of any potential threat became more frequent, until no one dared speak against him, even in private. Yet, as the empire fell into disarray, the Crimson Panther saw himself as the only one who could bring order to the world. His mind, consumed by the darkness, no longer allowed him to see the destruction he was causing. He believed that only he had the strength to lead, to crush his enemies and restore the empire to its rightful place. But the more he destroyed, the less human he became. Chapter 7, The Fallen Generals. The former generals, now living in hiding, began to unite once more. They knew that their old friend, the Crimson Panther, had become a tyrant beyond salvation. Yet, they couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for the monster he had become. They had once shared a vision, a dream of a better world, but now that dream was lost. The generals knew that they had to stop him, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Kahala, the leader of the resistance, began to reach out to the old allies of the Crimson Panther. They held meetings in secret, planning their next move. They were still outmatched, and the Crimson Panther's power was overwhelming, but they had no other choice. The generals and resistance fighters knew that their chances of success were slim, but the thought of allowing the Crimson Panther's reign to continue was worse than the thought of dying in battle. As they prepared for war, the generals wrestled with their own guilt. Each one carried the weight of the decisions they had made during the rebellion. They had helped the Crimson Panther rise to power, and now they were tasked with bringing him down. The battle ahead would not only be a fight for freedom but a fight to reclaim the soul of the man they had once called a brother. Chapter 8: The Last Stand. The day of reckoning arrived, and the resistance, bolstered by the fallen generals, marched toward the heart of the Crimson Panther's empire. The battle would not be an easy one, but they had no other choice. Kahala led the charge, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be the final confrontation. The Crimson Panther had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As the two forces clashed, the Crimson Panther fought with a fury unmatched by anything the resistance had ever seen. His strength was unparalleled, and his rage made him nearly invincible. The resistance pushed forward, determined to free their people from his grasp. But it was clear that they were fighting more than just a man, they were fighting a monster. In the midst of the chaos, Kahala found himself face to face with the Crimson Panther, the man he had once called a brother. The Crimson Panther's eyes were filled with madness, and his words were a twisted reflection of the man he had once been. Kahala knew that he couldn't reason with him, but he could not bring himself to kill him. Instead, they clashed in a brutal battle, one that would define the fate of the kingdom. Chapter 9: A Kingdom Reborn. With the battle ongoing, the Crimson Panther's forces began to waver. Despite his strength, his leadership was starting to crumble. The resistance had taken many key positions, and his once loyal followers began to question their allegiance. The kingdom, under the Crimson Panther's reign, had become a wasteland, and the people were desperate for change. In the final confrontation, as the Crimson Panther's forces began to break, he found himself torn. His former self, the rebel who fought for justice, was still buried beneath the surface. But the darkness inside him had taken root, and it no longer allowed room for mercy. The final blow was struck not by Kahala, but by the people, the very same people the Crimson Panther had fought for. They rose up in defiance, not with weapons, but with the will to reclaim their land. The Crimson Panther stood amidst the chaos, his power fading. His army, once a force of fear, now crumbled under the weight of his cruelty. With no one left to lead, the Crimson Panther was defeated, not by a single blow, but by his own monstrous creation. And yet, he did not die. Instead, he was cast into exile, his empire falling to ruin, and his journey far from over. Chapter 10: Exile and Reflection. The Crimson Panther wandered through the wastelands of his once great kingdom, now reduced to ash and ruin. His power was fading, but the darkness within him still clung to his soul. He no longer had an army to command, nor a throne to sit upon. The land he had once ruled now held nothing but the echoes of his mistakes. In his isolation, the Crimson Panther reflected on the man he had once been. The visions of his former self haunted him. The rebellion leader, the hero, the man who wanted to save his people, he was all but gone. In his place stood a tyrant, a ruler who had sacrificed everything for power. Yet, deep inside, a small ember of hope remained. He knew that redemption was possible, but only if he could free himself from the darkness that had taken root inside him. The Crimson Panther's story was far from over. Exiled and broken, he had lost everything. But he was alive, and that, in itself, was a chance for change. Would he seek redemption, or would he continue down the dark path he had chosen? Only time would tell. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the man once known as Chala would never be the same again.